Why is it that after confronting the deepest parts of yourself, the anger, the fear, the jealousy, the hidden wounds, you sometimes feel not stronger but emptier? Why does it feel like after facing your own shadow, the very force that was supposed to make you whole, you instead find yourself drained of motivation, drifting in a fog where nothing seems to matter? Carl Jung, the great depth psychologist, warned us that the shadow is not just a collection of our flaws, but the buried potential of our unlived life. Yet, as Jung reminds us, integrating the shadow is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning. And this is where Charles Taylor, one of the greatest living philosophers, enters the conversation. Taylor speaks of a world that has become disenchanted, a world stripped of meaning, where people wander without anchors, searching for what he calls cosmic connections. So when you put Jung and Taylor side by side, a pattern emerges. The modern self, stripped of enchantment, goes into the darkness of its own shadow. But when it emerges, it finds a barren landscape. Motivation doesn't return because the world itself no longer feels alive. The question then is not simply, have you faced your shadow? But what will you do after? How will you re-enchant a life that has been drained of wonder? This is the journey of today's video. Together we will explore why your motivation seems to vanish after confronting your inner darkness, and how Jung's psychology and Taylor's philosophy point toward a way of restoring meaning. Part 1. The collapse after confrontation. Imagine for a moment that you have finally done the work Jung asks of you. You've turned inward, looked honestly at your insecurities, admitted your envy, your rage, your suppressed desires. You've seen not just the mask you show the world, but the creature hiding behind it. In that moment, there is a strange relief. You know yourself better. But soon after, something terrifying happens. You lose momentum. The drive you once had to chase goals, impress others, or make it begins to dissolve. Why? Jung gives us a clue. The shadow is not just the bad parts of you. It is also the storehouse of the things you abandoned to survive. Your creativity, your freedom, your childlike curiosity, even your capacity for love. When you finally open that door, all those parts come flooding back, and the neat identity you built for yourself starts to crumble. The student who thought he was only a rational achiever suddenly feels the pull of music. The worker who thought she was defined by discipline feels a forgotten hunger for adventure. Your motivation dies because the old self that used to be driven by external validation is no longer enough. Charles Taylor helps us make sense of this collapse. In A Secular Age, he explains that modern life has lost its sacred canopy. We live in what he calls the immanent frame, world where transcendence feels closed off, where nothing beyond material success and personal satisfaction seems real. When you face your shadow in such a world, you don't come back to a culture that welcomes your newfound complexity. You come back to emptiness. You ask, what now? And no one around you has an answer. This is why motivation fades, because the goals that once fueled you, status, approval, money, competition, no longer grip the heart in the same way. You've glimpsed the inner depths, but the outer world feels flat. You stand in between, too awake to go back to illusions, but not yet grounded in something deeper. Part 2. The Void of Disenchantment. Here's where Taylor's philosophy pierces like a knife. He argues that one of the defining features of our age is disenchantment, the stripping away of cosmic meaning. In earlier times, people lived with the sense that their lives were woven into a larger story. The gods watched, nature spoke, rituals carried power, but modernity replaced this with cold rationalism. We were told the stars are just burning gas, the forest just timber, the self just neurons firing in the dark. So imagine what happens when a person, already living in a disenchanted age, confronts their shadow. They dig deep, discover the truth of their psyche, but when they resurface, they do not find a world full of mystery to hold them. They find silence, And in that silence, motivation withers. This is why so many after therapy, self-help or shadow work say, I understand myself better, but I don't know why I should care anymore. The why of life has been eroded. You can survive without it for a while, by chasing productivity hacks or external rewards. But eventually, the inner fire dies. Jung, of course, anticipated this. He knew that individuation, the process of integrating the shadow, must lead toward a larger connection, what he sometimes called the self with a capital S, a unifying principle that ties the individual back to the whole. But if the culture you live in no longer speaks of wholeness, of soul, of transcendence, then individuation feels like a trap. You've crossed the desert of your own mind, only to arrive at an empty horizon. Taylor insists that we cannot live without meaning. A disenchanted world leaves us spiritually malnourished, even if materially comfortable. And here lies the paradox. Facing your shadow takes courage, but it also rips away the illusions that once gave you energy. Without something greater to connect to, without re-enchantment, motivation naturally collapses. Part 3. The Crisis of the Modern Self. Carl Jung taught that the journey of individuation is not simply about self-discovery. It is about becoming a whole person. But what does whole mean in a culture that no longer believes in wholeness? This is the crisis of the modern self. You may conquer your inner demons, but when you step outside, you find that society offers no grand narrative, no larger canvas on which to paint your renewed self. Think about it. In ancient cultures, initiation rites brought the individual back into community with renewed purpose. A young warrior faced his fears in the wilderness, and when he returned, the tribe celebrated him. A monk confronted temptation and solitude, and when he emerged, he was welcomed as a spiritual guide. But in our modern world, you face your shadow in therapy, journaling, or meditation, and then what? There is no ritual, no collective affirmation, no social myth to receive you. Instead, you return to the noise of social media, the grind of daily labor, the pressure of comparison. Charles Taylor calls this the buffered self. Unlike the porous self of pre-modern times, who experienced spirits, gods, and cosmic forces as real, the buffered self lives sealed off, isolated in its own interior. When you finish your inner work, the outer world does not speak back. You are buffered, cut off from resonance. This is why motivation fades, because even when you grow internally, the external world does not echo your transformation. You feel invisible. You feel like your hard-won insights cannot be lived out in the public sphere. And here lies the deep contradiction. Jung gives us the map of the inner world, but Taylor reminds us that the cultural landscape has been stripped of its bridges. Facing your shadow without re-enchanting, the world leaves you standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into a void. The energy you thought would return after healing simply dissipates into thin air. Part 4. The burden of too much freedom. Another reason motivation collapses after shadow work is because freedom itself becomes overwhelming. When you integrate your shadow, you see that many of your old habits and ambitions were not truly your own. They were borrowed masks, expectations handed down by family, society, or culture. For a while, those masks gave you clarity. You thought you knew who you were. But once the shadow reveals the masks as illusions, you are left with too many choices. This is the paradox of modern freedom, which Charles Taylor captures with piercing accuracy. In our age, we believe that to be free is to choose our own path. But when every path is open, when no authority tells you which road is sacred, when no tradition claims your allegiance, choice itself becomes paralyzing. You ask, what should I do with my life? And there is no answer beyond your own will. Jung saw this too, though in a different register. He warned that the shadow, once integrated, confronts us with possibilities we had long suppressed. The artist hidden in the lawyer, the wanderer buried in the mother, the philosopher asleep in the entrepreneur, all rise up demanding attention. Each voice calls, live me, choose me. but you cannot live them all at once. So instead of motivation, you feel fragmentation. And here is the cruel irony. The very process meant to make you whole leaves you feeling scattered. The self becomes a battlefield of possibilities. Motivation collapses because every choice feels both possible and empty at the same time. You are free, yes, but in that freedom you are lost. Charles Taylor argues that this is not merely a personal struggle but a cultural one. Modernity tells us that meaning must be self-generated, but without a shared sense of transcendence, without a horizon of purpose larger than the self, our freedom becomes a burden. We drown in options and starve for significance. Part 5. The silence after illusions die. Perhaps the deepest reason motivation fades is because after shadow work, the illusions that once propelled you no longer hold power. Before, you may have been driven by the hope of fame, wealth, or recognition. These illusions gave you energy, even if they were shallow. But once you stare into your shadow, once you see how much of your striving was a defense against insecurity, those illusions dissolve, and with them the fire that once fueled you sputters out. Jung describes this moment as a psychic death. The ego, stripped of its comforting lies, feels naked. What once felt urgent, climbing the corporate ladder, chasing validation, proving yourself, suddenly feels meaningless. Motivation dies because the scaffolding that once held your will together has collapsed. Taylor helps us understand why this collapse feels so final in our age. In earlier societies, when personal illusions died, people still had collective myths to fall back on. The church, the cosmos, the ancestors, the gods. But in the disenchanted age, when illusions die, nothing replaces them. The silence is absolute. You realize you are alone in a universe that seems indifferent. And in that silence, the human will falters. But, and this is critical, both Jung and Taylor hint that this silence is not the end. It is a threshold. For Jung, the death of ego illusions clears the ground for the self, the archetype of wholeness to emerge. For Taylor, disenchantment is not total. Traces of meaning, whispers of transcendence, still flicker in art, poetry, community, and wonder. The silence after illusions die is terrifying, but it is also the doorway through which re-enchantment may enter. For now, though, at this stage of the journey, the seeker feels only the weight of emptiness. No illusions to drive them, no myths to sustain them, no clear path to walk. And so motivation collapses not as a failure, but as a necessary part of transformation. Part 6. The call toward re-enchantment. When you have passed through the silence after illusions die, you are left with a difficult truth. Survival is not enough. You cannot simply live without wonder, without belonging to something greater than your isolated self. This is the point where Jung and Taylor, though separated by a century, converge. Jung insists that the psyche is wired for connection to the self, that deeper archetype of wholeness that transcends ego. Taylor insists that even in a secular age, human beings thirst for what he calls fullness experiences where life feels radiant, alive more than merely ordinary. The collapse of motivation, then, is not the end of your journey. It is the turning point. It is the moment when you realize that your old engines of ambition will not carry you further. You can no longer be moved by shallow desires, by the race to prove yourself, by the empty promises of consumer culture. The fire must come from somewhere else. This is why Jung believed that individuation inevitably points toward a religious or spiritual dimension. Not religion in the narrow dogmatic sense, but in the sense of rebinding, reconnecting the self to the whole of existence. For Taylor, this is the work of re-enchantment, to see the world not as dead matter, but as a living field of meaning. Without this, shadow work leaves you stranded. With it, shadow work becomes the gateway to renewal. Motivation returns not when you chase after the same old goals, but when you begin to sense that your life is part of something larger, that your creativity is not just for self-expression, but for participating in the creation of meaning itself. Part 7. Practices of Reawakening. But how does one move from collapse to re-enchantment? This is not a matter of positive thinking or productivity hacks. It requires a reorientation of perception. Both Jung and Taylor point to practices that restore resonance with life. For Jung, dreams were one such doorway. He urged people to take their dreams seriously, not as random noise but as messages from the unconscious. In dreams, the shadow speaks, but so too does the self, the image of wholeness. By listening to dreams, symbols, and imagination, you begin to sense that the psyche is not a closed machine, but a living dialogue with mystery. Taylor, on the other hand, looks to art, ritual, and community. He argues that re-enchantment happens when we encounter beauty that exceeds our control, when we lose ourselves in music, poetry, or silence under the night sky. It happens when we participate in rituals that remind us we are not solitary atoms, but members of a larger story. It happens when we enter relationships not as contracts of utility, but as sacred bonds of trust. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means cultivating spaces where wonder is allowed to appear. It means stepping away from the endless scroll of distraction and allowing stillness to speak. It means seeking symbols, myths, and practices that awaken the imagination. It means daring to believe that the universe is not silent, but waiting for you to listen. Motivation, then, is not forced, it is reborn. It flows not from ego, but from alignment with the currents of life. When you feel that your work, your love, your struggles participate in something greater, energy returns naturally. This is what Jung called individuation, and what Taylor calls fullness. It is the restoration of resonance, the reawakening of meaning. Ending. From shadow to light. So why do you feel no motivation after facing your shadow? Because you have dismantled the illusions that once kept you moving, but you have not yet found the deeper well of meaning to replace them. You are caught in between, the death of false fire and the birth of true light. Carl Jung shows us that shadow work is only half the journey. To integrate the shadow is to prepare the ground for something larger, the self, the wholeness that unites opposites. Charles Taylor shows us that in our disenchanted age, this journey is harder than ever, because the culture no longer gives us myths and symbols to support the process, and yet both thinkers point toward the same truth. Human beings cannot live without enchantment. Motivation withers when life feels flat, but it flourishes when life feels alive with mystery. The task before you, then, is not simply to fight harder, push more, or grind your way through apathy. The task is to re-enchant your existence, to listen to your dreams, to seek beauty, to participate in rituals of meaning, to let yourself be touched by something greater than your own ego. The collapse of motivation is not your failure, it is your invitation. It is the sign that you have outgrown the old engines of ambition. It is the signal that you are ready for a deeper fire, one that does not burn out when illusions crumble. Facing your shadow is terrifying, but it is also the threshold of rebirth. On the other side of collapse lies the possibility of re-enchantment. And when you step into that, your motivation will not just return, it will be transformed. It will no longer be about proving yourself, but about participating in the mystery of being alive. This is the journey Jung began to trace, and Taylor reminds us to continue. A journey from shadow to light, from disenchantment to fullness, from collapse to meaning. It is your journey too, and it begins now.